There is a concept in fighting games known as a knowledge check, a situation a player can force the other into that has one solution to stopping it. While the solution may be solvable and countered, the information barrier is the true test of skill. It's not a competition of who's the better player, it's a competition of who knows more. Dead by Daylight has a serious knowledge check problem. Over the course of its almost 10-year-long history, Dead by Daylight has had a problem with its ever-growing informational barrier. As of the writing of this script, there are currently 41 killers, each with their own unique powers, complexities, and counterplay, 45 maps, each having its own unique layout and structures to learn how to navigate, and a whopping 300 perks to consider on both sides at any given moment. To put that into perspective, that's 8 more characters than Marvel Rivals, 14 more maps than Overwatch, and 16 more perks than every modern Fallout game put together. To say that Dead by Daylight has a lot to learn is an understatement, and not only does it expect you to learn each and every part of it, it expects you to understand how every variable is applicable to each one. Knowing how the Trapper runs a jungle gym does not mean you know how Vecna runs a jungle gym, or Wesker, or Clown, or even Ghostface. How does Endurance interact with the killer's power? Does it even interact at all? How many ways are there to get Endurance anyway? In fact, tell me. Right now, in Dead by Daylight, how many ways can you get Endurance? I'll wait. I hope you didn't Google it because I'm sure almost everyone is wrong. It's 7. There are 7 ways currently for a survivor to get Endurance. 6 are from perks and 1 is from the Knight Standard. Which one of these did you forget? And why was it the Knight? Let's look at these perks a little more, shall we? A new player boots up the game, picks whichever killer they think looks interesting, and downs a survivor. Another survivor comes out of the woodwork and heals their down teammate. The killer swings at the now healed survivor and whoops, they had Endurance. That scenario just played out in front of our eyes. Do you know what perk caused it? Well, the new player sure as hell didn't. They didn't even know that a perk just caused them to gain Endurance, much less what Endurance even is as a status effect, because the game has done nothing to even inform them that a status effect is even being applied. The only way to tell what actually happened in this scenario is to know that there are perks that grant Endurance when a survivor gets picked up, and that the speed of the heal dictates what perk it even was. Since this was a standard heal speed, we can see that it was Soul Guard and not We're Gonna Live Forever. But God forbid the survivor had a medkit, and now you suddenly have no way of knowing what survivor even gave the Endurance, adding the potential for another knowledge check later in the trial, if you even noticed the first one at all. This sort of situation happens at all levels of play, not just to new players. I recently had a match where I was chasing a Fong Min who just got off hook. I watched her sprint burst away at the start of the chase, didn't let up pressure, and in the middle of the chase she gained a massive burst of speed with no action taken. I was left starstruck for thinking for a brief moment that I had encountered a hacker. I stopped and thought to myself for a little bit in the chase. She should have still been exhausted from her first sprint burst with no time to remove the debuff in the middle of the chase by walking. I had to run through in my mind any way that could be possible with perks or items. It wasn't something like Duty of Care because I didn't hit another survivor. She still had her medkit, so it wasn't the new anti-exhaustion syringe. And that's when it clicked. Renato has a perk called Blood Rush, which lets a survivor remove the exhausted status effect for 60 seconds after being unhooked. This Fong was unhooked, sprint bursted away, and then used this incredibly uncommon perk to get another sprint burst. Once again, with zero indication from the game that anything involving a perk was even happening. No UI element, no notification, no animation, just a Fong Min gaining speed rapidly for visually no reason. The fact that my first thought was a hacker and not one of the, once again, 300 perks Dead by Daylight currently has should say it all. I've played this game for roughly 8 years, seen and played multiple metagames with multiple builds on multiple characters, and there was still something that escaped my knowledge base. Now imagine for a second a new player had seen that. They would be left starstruck that a player just did that. They wouldn't know how or why that happened, if it was even supposed to happen at all. Situations like this don't only benefit the survivor, of course. Killers like Deathslinger are entirely based around this very concept. Deathslinger's entire strength comes from being not only able to draw survivors in at range, but also know the small spots and gaps into terrain his bullet can fit through. Where is and isn't safe for a survivor to run safely to avoid being harpooned through a tiny gap that you would have to play Deathslinger to even know about. It creates a power imbalance where both sides overtly benefit from the other not knowing every possible detail and small context clues that indicate what's happening. It turns Dead by Daylight from a game of individual and macro knowledge skill into a pop quiz on every possible perk and power to consider in that situation. How having made for this affects the survivor's pathing of the tile, how Springtrap's axe having heavy gravity affects its potential angles and strength in a loop, how even something as simple as a survivor being picked up off the ground can influence every decision you make for the rest of the trial. Let's talk about some more examples. You load into a trial as a survivor and begin to look for a generator. Already in the span of not even 10 seconds, an experienced survivor can rule out or identify who the killer is without even needing to see them. Out of the current 41 killers, 17 have traits that give away who they are if you know what you're looking for. 5 of them will make their presence known very quickly via audio or UI cues, while the other 12 will have map objects or effects that are related to the killer power. And if you see or hear none of them, well, the experienced survivor just wrote out 41% of the total playable killers in the game, all within 10 seconds of loading in and not even seeing the killer. This of course doesn't account for the 4 additional killers that make themselves known early via add-ons or lullabies, in which case that percentage goes up to 51%. And on top of all that, if all that information gleaned from 10 seconds of loading in wasn't enough, 17 of the remaining 20 killers have unique chase music that is identifiable at 32 meters without even seeing them. Meaning the only killers you cannot identify with absolute certainty within those first 10 seconds are the Trapper, the Wraith, or the Cannibal. 2 of which will become very obvious very quickly. That's frankly a lot of information to gather on just loading into the map. Some may even say too much. I wasn't even aware of just how many killers you can zero out that fast until I started looking into it for writing the script. Honestly, now I'm just thankful that behavior shows the little facing the X killer pop up to new players when they queue into one of them for the first time. Because the alternative is throwing them to the meat grinder and figuring out who they're playing against on top of everything else the game throws at them. Speaking of new players, I'd like to talk about some situations I've witnessed firsthand recently in regards to clarity from game information to new players. Recently, one of my friends has gotten into Dead by Daylight, and I watched their first few killer games. In the same match, I had to watch them get hit by a head-on stun and be confused as to what even just happened, and later on watch them get blocked by a dead hard and also be confused. The game did very little in terms of explaining the situation, and it just inflicted on them. The closest they got was a tiny pop-up from the head-on stun in the top right corner of the screen that they were too engaged in the game and confused from the sudden stun to even comprehend. I had to on-the-fly explain to them that head-on was 1, a perk that existed in the game, and 2, how the survivor even used it to stun them. The same was true for Dead Hard. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be information wars within the metagame. In fact, I even support the idea of it because it breaks up the monotony and rewards dedicated players for learning the ins and outs of their perks and killer powers. Without some level of knowledge to learn, the game would grow stagnant and be simplified down to key points in the gameplay a lot quicker. That being said, the sheer amount of information coupled with the lackluster and downright disappointing presentation of said information causes a lot of issues in all levels of play. To quote Otstarva, you can play this game for thousands of hours and still see something new. And while that is not always a bad thing, without proper channels to understand said new concepts, it can and has become a very frustrating pressure point in regards to newer and less experienced players. Going back to the original argument for a moment, knowledge checks, while inherently frustrating, do have one massive downside that should always be considered. If both sides know and understand the check, then it doesn't really do anything. Think of it like this. A very common knowledge check in Dead by Daylight is a survivor walking away from the killer before a chase starts. This is the bait the killer into swinging their weapon and missing because the survivor is ready to get out of range with Sprint Burst. It's a simple but very common situation to find yourself in. It's overtly effective when it works because it wastes the killer's time while giving the survivor a leg up on a chase if committed to. But if, say, the killer knows and understands what's happening, they won't swing. They won't whiff and waste more time than needed. The survivor won't get as big of a head start as they thought they would, and overall play was just nullified. It's no longer a huge punishment because both sides knew and understood the situation. I like to equate Dead by Daylight to a fencing match a lot, where both sides are pushing on the other to make a mistake while using physical and environmental cues on the fly to figure out what the other side wants to do. That when running a tile, it's more akin to a tug of war for superiority than just simply running around a pile of trash until a pallet is dropped. It's those moments that Dead by Daylight shines from its knowledge net, where both sides have things to consider in that moment that change the ebb and flow of the game state. The issue Dead by Daylight has, however, is the overabundance and unreliable conveyance of said information. Perks, powers, add-ons, draft generation, texts have reached a and far beyond a critical mass of information for any one person to reasonably consume. It turns the average player from one who spends their free time playing Dead by Daylight into a common cutoff bar of 2,000 hours due to the sheer difference in strength players have just by the virtue of understanding all the moving parts. Often we see in the community questions of how all the big streamers and content creators of the game maintain such high win rates, how they could be also consistently above the rest. Surely not all of them are professional world champions, right? Well, to an extent, and to be fair, a lot of them are very talented players, but a lot of them have one innate advantage that has fueled not only their skill, but also their content: the knowledge. Their win rates are so massively higher than what is or what should be considered the standard because they have such a leg up on individual game knowledge over most of the player base. That's not to say most high-end players in any game aren't knowledgeable about their own game, but the gap in skill and consistency in Dead by Daylight is massively reflective of just how much there is to potentially learn about the game. In FPSs, for example, knowledge of sightlines and map layouts play a lot in the skill of a player. It gives them a clear path of progression over the course of their time with the game that isn't relying on raw mechanical execution, but also acts as a supplementary addition to their natural and trained skills. Their aim, their reaction times, even just their predictions, it's all informed by the knowledge. Where do I aim? How long should I wait to fire? Etc. But it's still only useful because they are talented enough to execute it. To go even further into the example and bring the entire topic back to where it started with fighting games, time and time again the top players of any given game are always consistent due to their individual skill and execution, but are informed by the knowledge they have of the game. Internalized details such as frame data, attack distances, interactions with system mechanics is a massive part of being good at fighting games, but it alone will not carry you to the top. At the end of all of this, I don't wish to be conflated with saying that Dead by Daylight takes no skill, as it's not what I'm saying. Individual player skill as a part of any game is of course paramount to succeeding. Just because you know the Deathslinger sightlines and terrain collision doesn't mean you are going to be able to play around it or abuse it without any effort. My point is that the mechanical skill check is vastly outnumbered and outvalued by the knowledge check, and that it's a problem that's only compounded by the continual addition of more perks and more killers and more maps. So where do we go from here? The means and clarity of information displayed to the player needs to be improved. The current system of showing the small perk icon and showing its name, but not always showing its name, isn't indicative of a helpful learning curve. I think a lot of the frustrations on the sudden random stuns would be alleviated if a player was told outright, "This just happened, this is why you were stunned." We'll use head-on for example, as it was a pressure point earlier. The current way the game conveys that head-on was used is the killer will make their audible stun noise, and on the killer's POV, they will see the head-on icon appear very briefly on their screen. While helpful to existing players that already understand what a head-on does, that doesn't help convey that it was even the fast locker exit that caused the stun in the first place. To help convey that, I think there needs to be a unique animation for head-on to showcase that it's something different than a survivor just leaving the locker. On top of that, I think having a visual indicator for stuns in general could really help showcase what's even happening to you in the first place. I'm not saying there needs to be a big flashing text screaming "you are stunned," but just a UI element that changes or is added when stunned. In my mind, the ideal would be some sort of color gradient applied to the sides of the screen, similar to Ghoul when they are enraged. Just something to briefly show the state of the game has changed instead of just yanking away control from the player. The next big change is that there needs to be a limiting factor on the introduction of more variables to consider. The constant ball juggling of balancing not only the game state but the potential information and counterplay of every scenario will only grow even worse and inhospitable with the continual addition of more and more perks and killers. That isn't to say I want them to stop creating content, but the rate they do it with what's already built up is just too much for even casual players to handle. The way I see it is that there's two possible solutions for this problem, ideally both. Stripping back the current number of perks that offer redundancy and compounding effects, and lowering the number of new perks introduced to the game from 3 per character to 1. One of the major reasons why there's so much compounding debt to learn is because a lot of the game's 300 perks offer a lot of redundancy in what they do, and in tandem with player skill and execution their usage, makes for seemingly impossible situations, where the only counterplay is just to inherently understand the fundamentals of each option. For example, do we really need 20 perks that make it faster or easier to repair gens to consider? Or 13 perks that give survivors exposed? Or the gargantuan 42 perks that can influence how fast a survivor can heal? There's just so much redundancy in these effects that consolidating them on both sides would help lower the initial legwork needed to understand what perks are even in play. A new player may understand how no one escapes death works after being hit by it once, but that doesn't mean they will understand how the far less common Rancor works despite similar conditions for activation. Due to the overlapping similarities in causation and effect, it can feel like playing from behind at all points. It can feel like you're playing a whole different game because things are happening outside of your norm with no rational explanation from it. You may know that resilience makes a survivor's actions faster while injured, but will they know that Deadline effectively does the same thing with more interactions to consider due to the delivery of its progress? On top of the overlapping perk design, Behavior have kept adding new perks that only inflate the problem more. Take the newest release with the Sinister Grace chapter. With its release we saw the addition of 6 new perks, all of which share similar design space with previous perks. Zeroing in on what is my opinion the most problematic in the aspect of the 6, Ghost Notes. Acting as a pseudo-hybrid of 2 other perks that already present problems in perk and information clarity, Vigil and Lightweight. It once again compounds the same issues these perks already present. If a survivor recovers from their exhaustion faster than you would expect, do they have Vigil or Ghost Notes? Or maybe they even have both and there wasn't the right answer. Having trouble tracking scratch marks because they seemingly vanish? Maybe it's Ghost Notes or Lightweight or a myriad of other perks that have effects that mess with the cohesion of scratch mark density for different but very similar reasons. While individually the strength of the perk isn't that strong, its mere existence creates more information to take in and consider in every interaction, which in tandem with everything else just adds to the ever-growing valley of perks that do similar things for different reasons. Finally, to cap off, the game needs to be improved on its introduction to new players across the board. The current tutorial is ancient and isn't indicative of a helpful learning experience once a player gets into the game. Its current tutorialized bot matches don't convey how the normal flow of a game, nor how interacting with the other side works. It creates false dichotomies of what the expectations are from the player and how the game will play out in actuality. To put it simply, these tutorials suck. A massive overhaul is needed to really hone in on what the general gameplay flow of a match will look like. Why players will do the things they do with an in-depth explanation and showcase of why certain things happen. Imagine a tutorial section where they showcase the different ways survivors can gain exhaustion, or the difference between a safe and a weak tile to hold. Perhaps a little idealistic in thinking, but thinking in broad strokes is the only answer I can really give. Even just a minor change to, say, a small tutorial element talking about perks, explaining what they do, how you get them, the types of things they can do, would go a really long way. On that note, I mentioned it earlier in the video, but I'd love to actually commend the one good feature that has been made apparent out of all of this. New players get that pop-up during the loading screen explaining who the killer is and roughly what they will do. If I were to take it a step further, I would have an explanation built into the killer menu itself that not only overviews their power in a more concise and better showcase manner, but a section offering counterplay options that talk about some of the more in-depth scenarios that may, and more importantly why, they come up. The Dead by Daylight knowledge depth problem continues to only grow worse and worse as each new chapter release compounds the issue of information clarity and cohesion. I hope behavior in their attempts to overhaul the tutorialization of the game takes care to actually acknowledge and work on these issues as well, because what's the point in helping new players play the game easier if they won't even understand what they're playing? And that's what this is really all for in the end of the day, isn't it? Those new or less experienced players that just want to play Dead by Daylight with their friends, but feel let down by the game itself. It's also important to once again note, this video is not a war on information obscuring. It's not a hate piece on the interactivity of the game at this level. It's a plea and an overview of how it's overtaken a lot of what makes the game fun by clowning it all in 300 perks, 45 maps, and 41 killers. That being said, I'd love to hear more thoughts on this topic. And I think it's a severely under-discussed topic that really should have more light shown on it in regards to why some players have so many issues with learning and understanding the game.